Hello, guys and girls. The program you are about to hear will be both fun and educational, but it is not a substitute for medical advice. Although we are doctors, we are not your doctors.
Hello and welcome to Travel Medicine. As always, I'm your friendly neighborhood internal medicine doc, Dr. J.
Hey all, this is your pediatric infectious disease doc and sometime researcher, Dr. Santhosh.
And sometime researcher. Today we are going to go back to our original, very first episode mission statement. You know how we used to call the show Travel Medicine, but we haven't really traveled a lot
well,
lately?
I mean, the name on the LLC still says Travel Medicine Podcast, yeah, but aside from our frequent jaunts in the Wayback Machine, which I think we're also going to take today, we haven't been doing much like around the world traveling, correct?
Yeah, the Wayback Machine doesn't fund itself. So you were kind enough, Santosh, to say, hey, maybe we should actually do what our podcast advertises and focus on the most travel-y of all the travel medicines. And to do that, we have a guest today who, Santosh, why don't you tell us a little bit about as we discuss the fascinating world of medical missions?
Yes, I am so honored to introduce Dr. Robert Hamilton, who is in my heart and in the hearts of many, many, a world renowned pediatrician here in Santa Monica, California. He's been working here in the Los Angeles area for just about 40 years, just shy of 40 years. And I know him as one of our educators at UCLA for a very long time, where I have helped care for kids with him. Aside from being an amazing clinician, he is an author, having written a beautiful book called Seven Secrets of the Newborn, as well as a podcaster. And you can find him on the Hamilton Review. And this pediatric infectious disease doc got to be a recent guest on there. So this is a beautiful crossover episode. Dr. Hamilton, thank you so much for joining us. And we're happy to talk about your experience in pediatrics as well as your mission work, Lighthouse Medical Missions.
So, gentlemen, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you both.
Before we get into what medical missions look like today, I always like to bring our guests for a tour in the Wayback Machine. It is where we blew most of our budget. And we can bring you along. How much do you know about the very first medical mission? Or the first documented, I should say.
So, are you talking about my first medical mission, or are you talking about medical missions in general?
Well, we're going to get to both, but let's start with in general.
Okay, so I am not sure that I know about the first medical mission. There are people like Schweitzer, who went to Africa, who was a doctor, of course, and he he went actually to a place which is now called Burundi. I am sure that there are many, many other medical missions in the past, and I just don't. That's a question I just can't immediately answer, other than Schweitzer.
So, Schweitzer and Livingstone were both late 1850s, early 1900s. But if we're going back to the beginning of modern era medical missions, we don't have to jump too much further. It's in 1830 when originally an American missionary to China named E.C. Bridgman noted that Western medicine tended to be a little bit more effective at removing cataracts of the eye than traditional Chinese medicine. So, at his request, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, good old timey name, I always like a well named government office,
Mhm.
sent their very first Protestant medical missionary to China. And Santosh, do you know what his name is? I know I called you earlier in the week about it because I was beyond excited to find this person existed.
I know. I'm still having trouble remembering. It was so Dr. Hamilton, Dr. Dworetsky is famously a comic book nerd, and he has a deep love of medicine and pop culture and everything crossing over. So it's one of your it's one of your favorite comic book characters, but I can't remember who it is.
Yeah, not to bury the lead, but the very first medical missionary that we have documented was named Peter Parker.
Hey.
Peter Parker. That's a great name. Does, but
Yeah.
now I can know I can answer the question Peter Parker, and I'll put that down. Amazing.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
the amazing spider missionary.
There, because we recently had the terrible movie Madame Web come around, and of course, I think her mom was bitten by a exotic spider in a jungle. I don't think Peter Parker, the missionary, acquired any spider-like powers.
No, just medical ones, and I don't think he
Yeah.
was bitten by a radioactive doctor.
Uh,
But Parker
He
wasn't.
may have got cholera, though. Who knows?
yeah, almost certainly.
Well, Parker was invited to parts of Chinese society that had otherwise been closed off to missionaries. So in 1835, he opened the very first hospital in Canton, where he treated over 2,000 patients in his first year. And this was originally called the Ophthalmic Hospital in Canton, also known as the Canton Pok Tsai Institute. Still one of the most well known ophthalmic institutes in the world. And Canton at the time was the only city in China that foreigners were allowed to set foot in, so it was the only place on the Silk Road where European and Chinese merchants could trade. So once he opened this hospital, in the very first year, he saw over 1,000 patients, and 96% of them had ocular illnesses, mostly cataracts, which he cured. You can imagine a hospital with a 90 something percent cure rate is going to develop a bit of a following.
Yeah, I wish I had those numbers.
So he said, all right, I think we've got eyes pretty well settled. And he was asked to begin treating ear illnesses. This led to him finding a number of patients with tumors, so he had to start doing other surgeries. These were also very high rate of success, as Western surgery was doing quite well in the late 1800s. Eventually, the hospital became so well known and in demand, it had to turn away patients because it became too much for a single physician. Now, the last bit I will tell you before we kind of jump ahead and we can talk about Dr. Livingstone as well is the hospital's Chinese name, Pak Sai, delightful. We often talk about how scientists are terrible at naming things. Well, it looks like they let the marketers handle this one. Pak Sai in Mandarin or Cantonese, I'm a little bit weak on this one, means universal helpfulness, which showed that everyone knew the hospital would serve all classes in the community, Chinese or foreign. So Peter Parker picked a peck of pathologic patients in the Pak Sai Universal Helpfulness Hospital.
Well put, Dr. Goreski. That's wonderful.
So, how does this bring us to our topic today? Well, Parker did eventually leave China, related his experiences and medical missionary work at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. As he said, here's how you can access other countries through healthcare. Scotland actually became a center for modern global healthcare missions. And this is how Livingstone kind of got sent out. He did begin as more of a Christian minister, and he became more known for his abilities as a healer and, of course, discovering the Victoria Falls. But he eventually, tired of medical work, began to doubt how effective it was as a form of ministry. And that's why we mostly know Livingstone for, well, getting lost, fighting against slavery, and being found by Stanley. So before we get into all the different places we can go on medical missions, let's bring it back around to your experience, Dr. Hamilton.
Sure.
What was your
Can
first
I
medical
add
mission?
one more final thing? You're correct about Scotland. Scotland did go to what was then known, this was pre-Israel, as it was known as Palestine in the old days. And there was a doctor who set up a clinic in the city of Tiberias, which is on they call Kinneret in Israel, but it's called Galilee for many people, the Sea of Galilee. And that was a very, very successful hospital. They treated many of the indigenous people who were there at that time. And of course, in those days, pre 20th century, that part of the world was very impoverished. That was before, obviously, the state of Israel came into its current state. But anyway, and I've actually, that hospital that he built over there is now a hotel. If you are ever in Israel, and I recommend that you go because it's a great country, then you can stay in that hotel. It is, I think they call it the Scottish Hotel, and it's actually an amazing, very high-end hotel, which I promise you will enjoy.
Cool.
So anyway, just a little when you start talking about the Scots, I'm reminded of that.
I have patients who treat every hospital stay like a hotel. So the opportunity to fly out to one that has been specifically repurposed for that was going to make an appearance in our later travel recommendations, and you have saved us the time. So do please check it out.
That's very good. Okay. By the way, the Scots also have a hotel in Jerusalem, which is right below the Jaffa Gate. And if you want a very relatively cheap place to stay, the Scots Hotel in Jerusalem, it has a great view of the old walls, and I recommend that as well. I don't know if you know about the Scots Hotel, Dr. Josh. You seem to know everything. But that's another
Only
recommendation I would
related
make.
to unnecessary trivia.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
once we had established these first medical missions in the early 1830s, the first society for medical missions was 1839, the Medical Missionary Society of China. Now, they operated from the 1900s, and from up until about the 1960s was the golden age of medical missions. You got a time of deep infrastructure building. You could decide as a doctor to hack into a jungle, build a hut that would become a clinic, that would one day grow into a hospital and then a teaching institution. And in a single generation, you could get a whole hospital and infrastructure where nothing had existed before. So hospitals and clinics sprang up throughout the world. About 60% of developing nations' healthcare prior to 1960 was delivered by various Catholic and Protestant missionaries. Interestingly,
Amazing. That is absolutely amazing, and I can believe that. But anyway, you're keep going. You're impressing me.
in 1894, male medical missionaries were about 14% of all missionaries, medical or otherwise. But women doctors made up a respectable, if low, 4% of, again, specifically medical missionaries, people who went out not just to enlighten or discuss their religious beliefs, but to actively treat people with medical care. So we saw from the 1800s to the 1960s a huge surge in building of clinics all over the place. But unfortunately, this bubble did eventually have to burst, and we got to around the late 80s and mid 2000s, and we didn't really have the philanthropy that had been encouraged by the early Victorian era. So, without financial backing, a lot of the infrastructure collapsed, and mission sending organizations couldn't really support running hospitals, supplying staff, and maintaining expensive equipment or drugs. So, a lot of hospitals became closed, sold, or nationalized, and that begins to bring us into what medical missions look like today. You're not going with the backing of a whole country. You're not going as a single lone individual out to create something. You're finding somewhere that's a little bit of a balance between the two. And I believe, Dr. Hamilton, that is where we begin to get your experience. So, what was your first medical mission? What does that world look like for you now?
So, well, thank you for the background, Josh. That was wonderful. It was really excellent. So, my first medical mission was at the behest of a friend of mine who I had met in Guatemala. I went during my final year of residency. I went to Guatemala for a month and studied there in Guatemala City, and ran into many, many people. One of them was a young doctor named Patricia Elvir, and she was as part of the she was at the hospital at that time, She was actually an American who studied in Guatemala, did her medical training in Guatemala, ultimately ended up in New York City, and married and had a family. And she married one of the Turtles. If you remember that rock group named the Turtles, they had a very famous song, "Imagine Me and You." I do. I
Oh,
think about you all the
yeah.
time.
Oh, and here I was
Anyway, I
thinking
won't sing it.
Michelangelo.
Yeah, or Donatello. We were
Right.
thinking of Ninja Turtles, Dr. Hamilton. Sorry. We're very juvenile.
It's just a
Yeah.
Well,
different generation.
Yeah.
that song may predate you guys, but anyway, that was a big song in this day. They were a little bit of a one-hit wonder group, but anyway, so Patricia, after I came back to the U.S., she called me and she said, "Hey, Bob, I have a friend in Nicaragua." And this was during the time of the Contra Wars. The Contra Wars, of course, were during the Reagan era. And we won't go into the politics of it, but it was a time when the Sandinistas were in power. The Sandinistas were headed up by a guy named Daniel Ortega. And it was really a bad time for Nicaragua. And there was a guy in Nicaragua, in Managua, by the name of Bob Trelease, and he had a small Protestant congregation there and said there's a great need for medical care here in Managua because we have no medicines. We have nothing. It is the infrastructure of the country was really frayed. So I thought about it and I went down. I think this was around 1986, 87 was that time. And I remember, obviously, a little bit frightened to go down to Nicaragua, kind of a war zone. But that was my beginning. And I got there, and I remember just diving in. And mind you, I'm a general pediatrician, so I can see patients without a lot of mechanical stuff or a lot of stuff. I can do a lot of primary care work on the field. So we opened buildings and said, who needs to, kind of open it up to the neighborhood. And we had hundreds and hundreds of individuals come through our clinic. And I remember getting on the plane, heading back to the US, and just feeling in my heart a sense of tremendous fullness and joy, and thinking, I'm going to come back. I'm coming back. I think when and this applies to any effort that people go out and help other people, there's a sense of great personal fulfillment when you do that. So I came back to the US and I told the story to many people. There was actually an article in the Los Angeles Times about that trip. One of my patients was a LA Times reporter and wrote a very kind article. And I began to talk about it and make plans for more trips. And it turned out that over the next decade or so, I went to Nicaragua like 15 times and continued to, build relationships down there. Ultimately met the president of Nicaragua at that time. Her name was Chamorro, President Chamorro. She was a woman. And it really had a tremendous, wonderful experience in Nicaragua, and helped a local doctor down there set up a clinic. We were able to send containers down and send equipment like X-ray machines and other things down, which was very needed at that time in Nicaragua. We went to a lot of different places in the country. Managua beginning there. We went to Granada. We went to eastern coast of Nicaragua, places like Bluefields, and which is on the Caribbean side of the country. So we got around the country pretty well, and I got to know the country very, very well. And then things kind of came to an end. It's complicated, but essentially there was some issues that happened and really precluded my going back to Nicaragua. But that was kind of how I got my feet wet in medical missions. What you were talking about before in terms of setting up hospitals in the jungle, this was a different dynamic. We were opening recreation centers, we were opening gymnasiums, sometimes even outside. We would hold clinics and basically do primary care evaluations. And if there was if we, and obviously we could treat simple things, ear infections, pneumonias, gastroenteritis, there are many, many rashes and different things we could take care of in the field. But clearly, if you had other more complicated diagnoses, and there were plenty of them, we had to refer these patients to their local hospitals. And that's exactly what we did.
how has your packing list evolved based both on your location and as you've gained more experience going from a fresh volunteer to somebody who heads up medical missions on your own? What sort of things are must haves, would likes, and beyond or out of the question?
So clearly, when you go down to these countries, you have to bring everything with you. They are places where I go, and we'll get into where I'm going now. But where we go, there's a paucity of medical supplies. There even medications are not available, antibiotics and what have you. So the must things that you have to have on a medical team obviously are medications. We buy those now internationally. We buy them in the Netherlands, and we typically ship them to wherever we're going ahead of our arrival. We also pack tons of medical supplies, bandages, um, IV fluids, and some medicines we bring with us from the U.S. as well. But so all of the different things that you can imagine, also diagnostic things like strep tests, urine tests, pregnancy tests, HIV testing, these kind of things, which now we can do and get a diagnosis in the field immediately. These are rapid tests which are available. We also bring with us. Sometimes we've had people who've come on the teams who are cardiologists, for example. And the amazing thing is we now are bringing portable echoes with us, and in the middle of nowhere, these cardiologists can do echoes, heart echoes, and make very technical diagnoses in the middle of a field, really. So it's pretty remarkable the progression that we have been able to make. Things like X-rays, of course, we don't have that available to us in these rudimentary areas that we go to. But those are the things that you definitely need to have. So we start with that. But really, Josh and Santhosh, what you really need are people. And depending on the people, the volunteers that we have on each team, and I should tell you that our teams are made up of volunteers completely. These are volunteer doctors and nurses and other non-medical personnel who come with us on the teams. It really is, it depends on who's coming. So if we have a dentist, for example, on the team, that we can do a lot of work in the field. Dentists can mainly, to be honest with you, the main thing that they do are extractions, because there are a lot of people who have the dental care in many of these countries is lacking, and you'll have people who come in who have major caries, and they need a lot of extraction. So we've done a lot of that in Africa and in Central America for sure. But so to a degree, we depending on who's on the team is what we bring with us.
Is there a specialty? So it sounds like you kind of have to decide what you're going to treat long before you head out, because certainly, Santosh, you would know this as an infectious disease doctor, you're going to need to be on certain antibiotics for a course, a length of time. So you have to be able to provide enough antibiotics to treat longer term infections or a lot of antibiotics to treat short term infections. Are there specialties that are more helpful? Now, I am a hospitalist and trained as such, so when I do go on missions, most of where my utility comes in outside of a hospital setting is in teaching. That's honestly the best thing I can do. I'm useless without being surrounded by a lot of the tech, so I focus on educating and bringing my colleagues or the counterparts in their native countries up to date with research, history, and uses. What specialties would you like to see? What specialties are maybe less helpful to have if people are interested in pursuing a medical mission?
So the the people the doctors who I love to be on my teams are generalists. Okay, those people who see things like family practitioners are phenomenal. Um, we have one doc who is a ER doc from San Diego who is amazingly very effective on the field. He's seen everything, of course, and actually very decorated ER doc. Unfortunately, he's now retired, but he's incredibly bright, and this guy really is, capable of doing really everything. And so when you don't have a lot of resources, and mind you, we're talking about rural areas where you're opening a where there are dusty roads, there are no hospitals. We're going into remote areas that are really underserved in terms of medical care. So when you go into those kind of places, um, clearly, if you like, for example, let me give you an example. I had a wonderful, well-known orthopedic surgeon who came on one of my medical teams. This guy did, he has, he's in the operating room all day long doing hips and shoulders and all the things that orthopedic docs do. Now, this guy happened to be very versatile, and he was able to do some basic medical care as well, um, seeing patients who had, hypertension and things like that. But this was not his specialty, right? He was an orthopedic doc. So that individual, I felt a little bit bad because we were not using him in the way that he could be used. Now, I love what you just said about teaching. We have done teaching, Josh. We have gone to uh, we've taught in hospitals. I've taught in Cuba. I've taught in Gambia, other places, Sierra Leone, and we do make ourselves available to the local medical community. We invite local medical students and doctors to join us. Sometimes we even pay them to join us, and we can work with them. And by the way, there's a reciprocity here. Sometimes these guys who live in these countries and they're in the medical world, they make diagnoses that we don't know about. We don't see malaria that often, and they go, "Though this is a case of malaria." We actually have rapid malaria tests now that we can actually verify that. Um, so we can, they have been beneficial to us too. So on every team that I go on, I have to tell you, we try to connect with the local community. But yes, teaching is a wonderful thing. This particular orthopedic doctor, we went to a town in Sierra Leone called Kabbalah. Kabbalah does not have a medical school. They hardly have a hospital. And so when I was with John, his name was John, if I had the opportunity, when I have people like that, I try to arrange for them to do teaching because that, in fact, is beneficial to the doctors there in the country, the national doctors, but is also a utilization of the skills that these very specialized people have. So that is something I want you to know that we think about, and certainly we're not there for very long, so we can't do a lot of intensive teaching because that pulls us away from our clinical role, which is seeing patients as well. So there's a balance in terms of how much we can actually interface with the local docs and the work that we have to do.
And I love that you mentioned the timelines because for any of our listeners who are considering going off to volunteer on a medical mission, that brings us to the next point that I do want to briefly touch on before we hand back to you, which is if you only have a week of vacation time versus 6 months off to volunteer, the medical missions you're looking at are going to be very, very different. So being clear about your length of stay and availability will help you to select. For example, don't bother applying to Doctors Without Borders unless you have at least 2 years of work experience and you've spent serious time in developing countries. There's about three different broad categories of medical missions. There's disaster response, where you are going to respond to a more immediate emergency, a tidal wave, an earthquake. There are long term development projects aimed at changing the communities, like we have done in the past with medical missions we've gone on with Water Hands Hope. Then you have mobile clinics where you're showing up to provide a need that the local community may not be able to fill in the immediacy, which ultimately can turn into a long-term development project. And the importance there is going to be making a plan to transition responsibilities over to skilled local clinicians eventually. Otherwise, you run into a possible controversy where what you're doing is creating a dependence on foreign volunteers. Now, I'm sure you've had a lot of experience with both not only providing care, but some of the controversies that have arisen in modern day medical missionary work. What can you tell us about those?
So this is a profound and a very very astute question. This is something that I struggle with because we do not want to engender a dependence on us. Is the wrong thing. What we try to do is we really what I want. Maybe I should back up and maybe say something that I haven't said before. I look at my medical missions as being a medical fair. Okay. We're screening, we're looking for, we do blood pressures, we do examinations, we do screening, we do urines, we do a lot of screening. And to a degree, we are then making referrals to what is available in that country. Now, mind you, some of the, like, for example, we were in Dakar, Senegal, about a year ago. Dakar is a big city, and there are resources there. The people who come to our clinic are just poor people. They don't have the funds to go to the hospital and see the doctors there. But what we do is we screen them if they have, significant hypertension. Obviously, we do bring hypertensive medications that we can give them and actually sustain them for a month or two or three even. But you guys know that that's something that needs to be ongoing. We certainly treat them for that condition, but they need to be referred to their local physician. Sometimes we actually provide them with financial support to do that. Some people need operations. If you find a person with a hernia, for example, well, hernias in this country are easily taken care of quickly. Over there, you can see gigantic hernias which have imperiled people for decades sometimes. And these poor people need to have a simple operation. And we sometimes will underwrite that kind of a procedure. In one clinic, we had a guy walk in who my ER doc I've referred to said, this guy's got an appendicitis. He really he needs to have an appendectomy like now. And so we literally put him in a car. We drove him to the hospital. We gave them money. Said this guy needs an operation. He didn't have any money. So we essentially bought his procedure. And by the way, in those countries, we're talking about hundreds of dollars, maybe $300 or $400 to have this done, and which is very different than this country.
That sounds like a dream.
Yeah, well, the
400,
hospital is not a
sign me
dream.
up.
Yeah, no, you don't want to actually have the procedure done there. Sorry.
Right.
But we, we were able to really. This guy was a save. I mean, he came in, and it was very clear that he was suffering acutely, and we were able to really rescue this guy and pull him out of the fire. But that, this is, if you think of it as being a health fair, we do what we can do. We bring in the local doctors. We make referrals accordingly. We also mind you, we are a Christian organization. We work under the auspices of churches, local churches, and pastors who really are the ones who invite us. And I will tell you, we do leave medications and some antibiotics and different supplies with these local pastors who we trust. Okay, and trust is a very important issue on the field.
Mm-hmm.
And say, listen, here is a storehouse. Not huge amounts of supplies, but we do leave bandages and different medical supplies with these local responsible individuals, and they can also minister to these people after we leave. Okay, but then again, we don't want to have these poor pastors being doctors. They're not skilled, but sometimes we can refill medications and give certain things out to people. So I do struggle with this idea of dependency, and we try to incorporate as much as we possibly can the local medical community to participate in for that reason.
And again, I don't mean to take away from any of the work you're doing. It's just something I do want our listening audience to consider. Because as I said, there's a wide variety of medical missions for a wide variety of reasons. And for those who may be interested in becoming involved, these are things to keep in mind. Have you worked alongside people from other backgrounds and cultures? Are you flexible and challenging and changing situations? If you're going to a place that's asking foreign medical professionals to volunteer, you can safely assume that the healthcare options on the ground are not ideal. Are you going to freak out when you arrive and there's a cockroach in your bed or the electricity and running water shutting off intermittently? And these are part of the reasons why you go out. So, what's one of the more creative solutions that you've had to come up with to treat a case while on a mission?
Certainly, we have had situations where we have actually had people on the team, surgeons who've done, and they're simple, like like an abscess, draining an abscess or something like that. And I don't regard that as a major operation, but there are procedures that do come up, and we've had to, figure out a way to make a sterile field. We can do that, of course, but also, sometimes you need to use flashlights to actually, in the dark. We have had to been kind of improvising in terms of, we don't have gurneys over there, so we don't have operating room tables, but you kind of put them on a table, and
Yep.
you have people who are shining lights, and as the procedure goes on, essentially, you find the sutures, and we bring all of that stuff with us, so we're not completely barren when it comes to this stuff. But there are times when we have done simple procedures, safe procedures, that they would, if they had to go to the hospital, they may not be able to afford it. Number one. Number two, they may not be able to get in, and the hospital, frankly, may not have the antibiotics or whatever to follow up on these cases. And we bring all that stuff with us, anticipating that kind of stuff. But in terms of, sometimes it's kind of makeshift. I can tell you, when you have to put an IV in a person and hydrate them, when they have diabetes and their sugars are 700 or something like that, you have to do things. And I can tell you that sometimes the IV pool is a volunteer. They sit there and they hold the IV up, and the person's like on a on a table or even on the ground sometimes.
Oh, and
So
the pole is a gentleman or a lady just standing up with their hands suspended
that's
as
correct.
long as they
That
can.
is
Got it.
Yeah. And so that is the IV pole. The bed is a blanket with on the ground that they're laying on, and sometimes you need to give IV antibiotics. We've had kids who've come in, and they need like a ceftriaxone, and we can give them a shot, of course. But sometimes these kids come in and they're dehydrated, and we put an IV into them, and they need to be there, or we tie the thing to the wall. We, a thatched. I'm thinking about one kid who came in and he was sick as he could be. Put an IV into him, we hydrated him, we gave him antibiotics. He did well, by the way. But he was in a thatched hut, and essentially the IV pole was the thatching. We tied
Yeah,
it
you
to
were
the
able to
wall.
connect it to the top with a little hook.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that's what we do, and live by our wits out there sometimes. We don't really like that, but we do what we can do. The people who come on my teams are, I'm telling you, they're phenomenal people who are flexible, who are smart, and who can get the job done. And that's kind of what you do when you're on the medical field.
I do want to emphasize one wonderful thing that was in everything that you said, that I really love and that I find true as well. A person who goes out to volunteer, you do have to learn to improvise and adapt and everything else like that. But the folks who are locally there and who teach you how to work through a problem, diagnose something you might never see here in the United States for, any number of reasons. That exchange of knowledge and culture is also terribly valuable. And I'm sure you've noted this as well, but when you come back home, you have new knowledge to share with your patients
That guy's got
Yeah,
an appendicitis. I just need a rubber sandal, a box of cornflakes.
No, hopefully, I don't know that you're bringing the field work back home.
yeah, no, I sometimes, come back and I practice medicine in Santa Monica, California, which is a relatively affluent community, and I come back and I sometimes, when I hear, people complaining, I kind of,
Oh, sure. Yeah,
I don't necessarily, browbeat anybody over here, but
sure.
I do kind of chuckle to myself about, these are the complaints that people have. Listen, I come back to America thankful for the blessings we have in this country, the amazing resources we have at our doorstep, really. And it does make me really, grateful for the blessings we have. I do come back with knowledge. I also come back, gentlemen, with a lot of pictures. I take a lot of pictures of things I see, and I share them with my colleagues here in my office and other people, and say, "What do you think about this?" And also, you see things that you don't see. You see illnesses which have gone, which are not there, there's no intervention. Okay, for
Hmm.
example, hydrocephalus is one example. Children who have I see kids who have hydrocephalus over there. Now, mind you, that child in America would have had a shunt put in, and their heads wouldn't have grown. But you sometimes see children who have heads the size of basketballs, and you kind of go, "Oh my gosh!" and they're affected by this in a very bad way, of course.
Hmm.
And you see things that you don't see in America, and it is shocking when you see the course of an illness which has not been there's been no intervention in whatever they have, infections or whatever. So you see things, osteomyelitis and things like that. Kids who have congenital dislocation of the hip, and you have this one leg which is 5 centimeters shorter than the other leg, and you kind of go, "Oh my gosh, this child would have had an operation and would not have been consigned to being really a lame individual and requiring crutches all their life." There are things that you see that you don't see in this country for sure, and you learn a lot. I can tell you that my knowledge of medicine has been greatly expanded by the number of medical teams I've been on. So this has been, and I don't do this necessarily for myself. I'm not going out there to, it's not like I'm going out there to really, I try to maintain that my desire is to really help people in their need. But there is you do garner knowledge and understanding and wisdom by just being out there in the field. If nothing else, culturally, you learn a lot about different peoples. By the way,
Hmm.
people are the same all over the world. They love their kids. They like to be well. They don't like to be sick.
Hmm.
They like food. There are a lot of things that you learn about people when you go out in the field. And I will tell you, this has been one of the great blessings in my life, that I have been I kind of backed myself into medical missions, and it's been a good thing for me.
So let's hear a little bit about your organization, Lighthouse Medical Missions. What can you tell us? What is its stated purpose? It sounds like you're working predominantly in pediatric care. Are you trying to provide just one particular kind of pediatric care? Do you focus on mobile clinics? What what is your individual mission?
So, Lighthouse Medical Missions is not a big organization. We are small. We're a handful of people who are committed to. First of all, we're committed to Christianity. We do minister the gospel when we're out there. So that's number one. But there's when I think about what we do, I say this all the time. But when Christ was here among us, um, he was a very he was a very practical individual. He didn't require us to climb to a mountain and, get to him. He came to the people, and he did practical things. He healed people, he touched people, he fed people, he took care of the down and out. He spoke with prostitutes, he spoke with, tax collectors, people who were despised by the culture, and he was a man of the people. And that's kind of what we want to do. We want to be people who reach out in a very practical way with our faith, which is what Christ did. And also, so we start with that. Okay, number one. Number two, we look at the needs of the people and we try to meet their needs. When we were in Colombia, we fed people. We actually had a full-on feeding program. There's a group called the World Kitchen, which became kind of had a little bit of moment. Unfortunately,
Oh
when
yeah, Jose
they had
Andres organization.
Jose Andres. Yeah, we worked with Jose Andres organization in a place called Cucuta, Colombia, where the refugees, which were pouring out of Venezuela at that time, where they came across the border, they were desperately hungry and they had nothing. Well, in that situation, we were able to provide thousands and thousands of meals for these people, working with the World Kitchen. Jose Andres was not there, but his people were there. So we try to meet the people in addition to medical care, we try to meet the people in terms of just what their social and their immediate needs are. But clearly, in terms of our organization, we go to places where there's a need. Number one, we have been to post-conflict countries like Nicaragua was one. We went to Burundi after the um, Burundi and Rwanda actually experienced the same, Hutu and Tutsi conflict. And we've been to places where they're where things are bad, and that's what we kind of look for. Where places where there's a real need, and we're generalists. Like I say, we set up our clinics are short; they're about a week in length. We go there, we open the doors, we take care of all the people in the neighborhood, and we then make the referrals. It is, some people say this is kind of a futile effort, Bob, because the need is so great. Of course, the famous story of the guy walking along the shore and the starfish who are dying on the shore, and he picks one up and throws it back in the ocean. And people ask him, "Why are you doing what you're doing?" And he goes, "Well, I'm trying to make a difference." And he goes, "How can you do that? There are millions of starfish on the shore." And he throws one back in and says, "But I helped that one." And to a degree, that's kind of our attitude. We try to do what we can do. We cannot do it all, but we do reach out in a humanitarian and a Christian viewpoint and say we're trying to help one at a time, and that's kind of our goal. And that's what we're not trying to fix the country. We can't fix each country we go to. There are too many needs, but we do make a difference for the people we minister to.
And as we begin to wrap things up, because I don't want to take too much of your time, but for anyone listening who's interested in becoming involved in a medical mission or wants to know more about it, what would you say to encourage or dissuade them? Not everybody may necessarily be cut out for this kind of work, and I don't know if you can know that until you're on the ground. So, what advice would you give to help people make that decision who may be struggling with it themselves?
Sure. I think if you even have that thought of going on a medical team, you're halfway there. Because this doesn't, people don't think about this routinely. But if you're thinking about it, I mean, it is a wonderful experience. You don't have to be, I don't certainly don't expect the people who come on my medical teams to go on every medical team. Everyone's not going to be me, and I know that. But it is an opportunity to see the world in a different way. This is not tourism. Where when you go there, you're having a very intimate, deep relationship with the people you're dealing with. So you actually see countries in a way that you never would have before. We were just in Jamaica recently, took care of hundreds and hundreds of people there. And I can tell you, people go, "Oh, you went to Jamaica? How cool is that?" And I go, "Well, we were we weren't in a 5-star hotel. We were actually we were actually dealing with the people."
Yeah.
So I think if you want to have that kind of experience, it's eye opening. It gives you a sense of gratitude, certainly when you come back. I do think you have to be a person who's relatively in good shape. You have to be, you have to be willing to endure, long travel. You have to be willing to not have the best hotel necessarily, and all those you have to have a little bit of flexibility. But this is an adventure. Each team is different. Each team is an opportunity to really grow personally and I recommend it to people. Maybe that isn't what you're cut out to do, but I like to challenge people to at least try one time. You might be surprised.
So
Very cool.
a few things to just add on to that. Um, red flags to look for, and correct me if you can think of any others. Is there a vetting process for volunteers? Yes, you can find a role for everybody, but there should be at least some kind of background. As you already mentioned, this should be something that you want to do to genuinely help, not just for the gram, as it were. Um, are there interpreters along? How are you planning to provide care to your patients without speaking their language? So, even if you are unable to provide interpretive services yourself, there should be someone along who can communicate. And I will mention only because you do work extensively with pediatrics. I know there's a lot of controversy about working in or around orphanages at all, even when they are very stand up organizations. The constant rotation of faces who are not coming back all the time is discouraged. So it can be very tricky to work in the orphanage setting. So I would encourage people, if you are going to get involved, look for something that focuses on the medical, that vets its volunteers, that provides interpretive services, and has a clear goal they are trying to accomplish. And then once you've done all of those things, you can start looking into your time available and which organization may work for you. Dr. Hamilton, are you accepting any volunteers, or where is your next trip if people want to
Sure,
hear more from
absolutely.
you?
People, if there are people hearing this program right now and they have an interest, they can definitely. I mean, you can call me directly, really. Um, we don't. Our teams are not big. We have, our teams are probably 15 to 20, maybe 25 people on a team. That's a big team. But about 15 is kind of the sweet spot. So yes, if you have that desire in your heart to do something, you can call me directly. I'm very much available, I'm readily found in Santa Monica, California. Dr. Hamilton is my last name, and so you can find me and give me a call. I have no problems talking to people and letting people, kind of vetting them. Some people, have kind of a passing interest, but it doesn't quite work out. I get that too, and I keep a very open mind, but people are welcome to come on my teams. I enjoy it. I enjoy meeting other people, so they can call me directly.
And I believe that brings us to the end. Now, we covered a lot of ground in this episode, all the way from China in the 1830s through South America, through Africa. So there are a wide range of places. Now, if you'd like to maybe explore medical mission work, but you don't want to get all the vaccinations involved, of which there are many, there are a lot of organizations that will still allow you to help out in the continental US. So you can dip your toe in the water that way. But we do emphasize the travel aspect of it. We should. We've been talking about it for 10 years.
Mhm.
And I think that will wrap up. So, Santosh, do you have any other questions for Dr. Hamilton before we let him proceed with his day?
No, I think that was absolutely wonderful. And thank you so much for your time. And of course, everything that you do here in our community locally, Dr. Hamilton, as well as, all the wonderful little kids that you treat abroad.
Thank you, gentlemen. It's been a pleasure to share with you today.
So thank you so much. We will leave info in the show notes for how to get a hold of Dr. Hamilton and his organization. As always, we love to hear your comments, questions, and feedback. If you'd like to support us spiritually, emotionally, or financially, links to do that are in the show notes, along with those links for further reading. Until next time, the show is produced by me and Santosh with a lot of help from our friends. Our theme music is composed by Rachel Leisure. And as always, keep a song in your heart, soap on your hands, a shot in your arm, a spin on your globe. When you've done all of those things, pick a country that looks fun to visit, get the necessary vaccinations, and set off with a mission on your own. Happy travels.
Bye, everybody.